The first thing the fog took was the horizon. For a town like Havenwood Creek, cupped in the palm of ancient mountains, that's like stealing the walls of your home. At first, no one minded. We called it the gray, a soupy, persistent mist that muffled the world in a blanket of quiet. But I map things. I measure the world to make it real. And when I checked my survey points, I found the distance between the Old Oak and Miller's Ridge was 7 feet shorter than it was last week. That's when the real fear began. The gray wasn't just hiding the world, it was eating it. My name is Leo Vance. My life is a grid of longitude and latitude, of contour lines and elevation markers. In my small house on Chestnut Lane, the world is held in place by pins on corkboard and ink on vellum. I am a cartographer. It's a profession that sounds archaic, like a cooper or a town crier, but the county still needs its property lines defined and its infrastructure plotted. For me, it's more than a job. It's a creed. To map something is to give it definition, to prove it exists. After what happened in the city, the blackout, the suffocating disorientation of being lost in a concrete canyon with no stars, no landmarks, no sense of self, I swore I would never be directionless again. Havenwood Creek was my sanctuary of certainty. Every street, every trail, every whispering creek was a known quantity. Until the gray. It rolled in on a Tuesday, which felt wrong. Fog in this valley is a creature of the dawn, a silver ghost that burns away by mid-morning. This fog was different. It was heavy, opaque, and utterly motionless. It swallowed the morning sun and left the town suspended in a state of perpetual twilight. It had no scent of rain or damp earth. It had no taste. It was the color of nothing, and it clung to us for 3 solid days before my finely tuned world began to fracture. The first crack was a sound. I was in my office, a room where chaos is forbidden, calibrating the gimbal on my grandfather's old brass transit. It's a museum piece, but I keep it as a reminder that the most reliable tools have no batteries. At precisely noon, the bell from St. Giles Church began to chime. It was a sound as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. A deep, resonant peal that always came from 3 blocks west and 1 block north. But on that Friday, the sound was wrong. It was faint, muted, as if coming through thick layers of cotton, and it was displaced. My ears, trained by years of my personal sensory mapping project, knew instinctively that the sound was not coming from the west. It was coming from the east, from the direction of the old quarry. I froze, my hand hovering over the transit. I walked to the window, peering into the dense, uniform gray. It had to be an acoustic illusion, a trick of the fog's density playing with the sound waves. Sound can bounce, it can be distorted. I jotted a note on my desk pad. Noon bell, acoustic anomaly, possible thermal inversion effect. A rational scientific explanation. It made me feel better. It made the world feel solid again under my feet. The feeling didn't last. The next day, Saturday, was a field day. I had a county mandate to resurvey the western boundary markers near Miller's Ridge, an area known for minor land shifts. I loaded my gear into my truck, the expensive, GPS-enabled theodolite, ranging rods, and as always, my leather-bound field journal. The drive to the edge of town was unnerving. The gray was so thick that my headlights barely punched a few feet into the murk. It felt like driving through an endless tunnel of smoke. The world beyond my windshield had ceased to exist. When I reached the trailhead, the silence was the first thing that hit me. Not quiet, silence. The kind of absolute void of sound that presses in on your eardrums. No birds, no rustle of unseen animals in the undergrowth, no hum of wind through the ancient pines. Just nothing. I set up my tripod, the metal legs sinking into the damp soil. The first survey point was an old gnarled oak tree, a landmark that appeared on maps going back a century. My GPS unit struggled, its screen flashing satellite acquisition failed several times before finally locking on. I took the reading, my breath misting in the still air. 44, 1736 degrees north, 122, 4731 degrees west. I checked it against the county records. Correct. Then I aimed the theodolite's laser at the survey marker on Miller's Ridge, a brass disc set in a granite outcrop nearly a mile away. The laser was invisible in the fog, but the receiver on the marker would register it. I waited and waited. No return signal. The fog was too dense, absorbing the light completely. All right, old ways it is, I murmured to myself, the sound of my own voice startlingly loud in the oppressive silence. I fell back on triangulation and the old maps, a more complex but foolproof method. It took me 2 hours of meticulous calculations, of checking and rechecking my angles, of pacing out baselines. My breath hitched as I scribbled the final equation into my journal. I ran the numbers again, and a third time. It couldn't be right. According to every measurement, every calculation, the distance between the ancient oak and the marker on Miller's Ridge was 5,273 feet. It was supposed to be 5,280, a perfect mile. It was 7 feet shorter. A cold dread, slick and oily, seeped into my bones. 7 feet don't just vanish. A mountain doesn't shrug its shoulders and pull itself 7 feet closer to a tree. Landslides, erosion, those things leave scars, evidence. This was a seamless, impossible alteration. As if a celestial editor had simply deleted 7 feet of the world and stitched the gap closed without a trace. I packed my equipment with trembling hands, the earlier silence now feeling menacing, watchful. Back in my truck, I sat for a long time, staring into the formless gray. I thought about the displaced bell. I thought about the missing 7 feet. My sanctuary of certainty was crumbling. On Monday, I went to see Sheriff Brody. His office was an oasis of comforting, mundane reality. The smell of stale coffee, the clatter of a dot matrix printer, the walls covered in photos of the high school football team. Brody was a big man, folded behind a small desk, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the local granite. He listened patiently as I laid out my findings, spreading my maps and calculations across his cluttered desk. He peered at the numbers, then looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "Leo, I appreciate your diligence. I really do. But you said it yourself. The GPS was on the fritz. And this fog, it plays tricks on things. On light, on sound, probably throws the laser off too." I didn't use the laser, I insisted, trying to keep the frantic edge out of my voice. This was analog, triangulation. The math is sound. The math might be sound, but your starting point might be off. Maybe the old maps were wrong. People made mistakes back then. 7 feet is not a mistake, I countered. It's a fundamental change. And what about the church bell? I heard it coming from the east. Brody sighed, leaning back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "Son, you're thinking too hard. You live up in your head with all these numbers and maps. It's been a gloomy few days. Everyone's feeling a little off. My advice? Go home, pour yourself a whiskey, and wait for the sun to burn this soup off. Things will look right again when they look right again." He was humoring me. The cartographer who cried wolf. I left the station feeling more isolated than ever, the neatly folded map of my findings in my hand, feeling less like evidence and more like a page from a madman's diary. The world was shrinking, and I was the only one with a ruler. The next piece of the puzzle came from Mrs. Gable. She lived 2 houses down from me, a sweet old woman whose prize-winning roses were the pride of Chestnut Lane. I saw her struggling with a heavy bag of fertilizer and went over to help. The roses were looking wilted, their leaves a sickly yellow. "It's this gray," she said, her voice a papery whisper. "No sun. They need the sun." "They'll bounce back," I said, hoisting the bag onto her porch. "You've got the greenest thumb in Havenwood Creek." She smiled, a small, sad gesture. "It's just so quiet now. The house feels bigger than it used to." "Well, it must be peaceful with your son David off in Denver. You get the whole place to yourself." The smile vanished from her face. She looked at me, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. Her eyes, usually a warm, sparkling blue, were flat. Blank. "David?" she asked, the name sounding foreign on her tongue. "I'm sorry, dear. I don't have a son." I stared at her, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. "Your son, David. The architect. You showed me pictures of his wedding last Christmas." I could see the photos in my mind's eye. A smiling young man with Mrs. Gable's blue eyes, his arm around a bride in a white dress. Her confusion curdled into something like concern, but it was directed at me. "Leo, are you feeling all right? I've never been married, never had any children. It's just always been me." The certainty in her voice was absolute. There wasn't a flicker of doubt, no sign of a failing memory. It was a statement of fact from her reality, a reality where a man named David Gable had never existed. I mumbled an apology, something about getting my neighbors mixed up, and retreated to my house, my mind reeling. I spent the next hour tearing my office apart, searching for the town's Christmas newsletter. I found it in a stack of old mail. I scanned the page of community photos. There was Mrs. Gable standing by the town's Christmas tree, alone. The space next to her, where I distinctly remembered her son and his wife standing, was empty. This wasn't a memory lapse. This was a retroactive edit of the past. My hands shook as I grabbed my keys. I had to prove I wasn't going insane. There was one place where the truth had to be written in stone, or at least in ink: the town hall. The hall was quiet, the air thick with the smell of old paper and floor wax. I nodded to the clerk and headed straight for the records room in the basement. It was a cramped space filled with filing cabinets and heavy, leather-bound ledgers. It took me 20 minutes to find the right volume. Births, 1985 to 1990. I ran my finger down the G's Gable. My breath caught in my throat. There it was, a single entry for Gable. The date of birth was there. The parents' names were there, Eleanor and Robert Gable. But the space for the child's first name, the space where David should have been written in the clerk's elegant cursive, was a faded, empty patch of paper. The ink hadn't been scratched out or chemically removed. It was just gone, as if it had evaporated from the very fibers of the page. I stumbled back from the ledger, a wave of vertigo washing over me. I leaned against a filing cabinet, the cold metal a feeble anchor in a world that was coming undone. The gray wasn't just eating the land, it was consuming history. It was devouring people, and then it was devouring the memory that they were ever here at all. On my way out of the town hall, my feet numb and clumsy, I walked through something. One moment, I was in the main hallway, the sound of my shoes echoing on the linoleum, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The next, I was in a bubble of total, profound silence. The hum of the lights vanished. The echo of my footsteps died. The distant chatter from the front desk was gone. It was as if the universe's sound mixer had abruptly slid my channel all the way down to zero. I stopped, my heart pounding in my ears, the only sound left in existence. I looked around. The hallway was the same, but it felt thinner, less real. I took another step, and the sound of the world crashed back in on me, so sudden and loud that I flinched. A stillness pocket. That's what I called it in my mind. A pocket of the gray's absolute silence, an invisible dead zone in the middle of an ordinary hallway. It had lasted for maybe 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds, I felt a terror more profound than anything I had ever known, the terror of being completely and utterly erased. I ran from the building, gasping in the thick gray air. I looked back at the town hall, then down the street toward the center of town, and I realized with a final, soul-shattering certainty that Sheriff Brody was wrong. Things weren't going to look right when the sun came out. The sun wasn't coming out, and the world wasn't just looking wrong. It was being unwritten, and I was the only one left who could still read the words. For 2 days, I didn't leave. I subsisted on stale crackers and cold coffee, the world outside reduced to the uniform, featureless gray that pressed against the glass. My time was spent in a frantic, obsessive ritual of verification. I cross-referenced my own hand-drawn maps, the ones from my personal sensory project, the ones filled with notes on the smell of pine on Ridge Road after a rainstorm, or the specific creak of the third step on the library porch, against the official digitally rendered county GIS data on my computer. The discrepancies were growing like a cancer. On my computer screen, the digital map of Havenwood Creek was pristine, clean, and wrong. It showed Elm Street connecting directly to Main, with no mention of the little cobblestone alleyway, Briar Lane, that had always been there. I knew it was there. I'd mapped it myself, noted the way it always smelled of yeast from the bakery and damp moss, but according to the county's official record, it had never existed. When I tried to search for the property records of the 3 small shops that lined it, a watchmaker, a tailor, a small bookbinder, the database returned a sterile no results found. But on my own map, drawn in permanent ink on archival paper, Briar Lane was still there. A defiant straight line of ink against a world of digital denial. That was the key. I felt it with a sudden electrifying clarity. The gray, whatever it was, had an appetite for the ephemeral. It consumed digital data, rewrote electronic records, and erased human memory as if wiping a hard drive. But it seemed to struggle with the physical, the analog, the tangible. The ink, soaked into the fibers of paper, held a truth the pixels on a screen could not. It was a scar the gray couldn't heal. This realization didn't bring relief. It brought a new, more profound terror. It meant there was a pattern, a set of rules to this madness. This wasn't a random, chaotic event. It was a process. And a process implies a purpose. My new obsession became mapping the decay. I became a cartographer of absences. On a large topographical map of the valley pinned to my wall, I began to mark the inconsistencies with red ink. A circle around the 7 missing feet at Miller's Ridge. A cross over Mrs. Gable's house with the note, David Gable, erased. An X over the spot where Briar Lane used to be. I also began plotting the stillness pockets. After my experience at the town hall, I had started carrying a small analog sound level meter with me. The needle would drop to absolute 0 when I passed through one of the pockets, and I would quickly mark the location on my map. They were appearing all over town, small, transient voids of reality, like bubbles in a dying solution. My map was becoming a battlefield, a document of a silent, one-sided war. I knew I couldn't stay locked away forever. I needed more proof, more physical evidence. I needed to find a place where the town's history was etched in something more permanent than memory. The Havenwood Creek Historical Archive, housed in the library's basement, was my next destination. Before I left, I did something that felt both foolish and necessary. I packed a survival kit of sorts into my old canvas rucksack. My field journal, a dozen sharpened pencils, my grandfather's brass compass, a ball of twine, and a Polaroid camera. If the digital world was a lie, I would arm myself with the analog. Stepping outside was a physical shock. The gray was thicker than ever, and the silence had deepened. The ambient hum of a living town, the distant drone of a refrigerator, the bark of a dog, the drone of a passing car was gone. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, suffocating. It felt like a presence. As I walked toward the library, I saw Mr. Henderson mowing his lawn. The sight was so jarringly normal, it felt surreal. But as I got closer, the details began to fray at the edges of my perception. Mr. Henderson moved with a placid, repetitive motion, back and forth, back and forth. The lawnmower, however, was silent. It made no sound as it passed over the grass, which didn't appear to be cut at all. He didn't look up as I passed. His eyes were unfocused, staring into the fog. He was a phantom, an echo of a routine, left behind by a world that was fading away. I hurried past, a cold sweat on my back, not daring to call his name. The library was a tomb. The lights were off, and a notice taped to the door read, "Closed due to power failure." I knew it was a lie. The streetlights outside were still glowing dimly through the fog. This was an excuse, a reason to keep people out. The lock on the side door was old, and it took me less than a minute with my multi-tool to spring it. Inside, the air was cold and still. The main reading room was filled with amorphous shapes of tables and chairs shrouded in the gloom. I navigated by memory, my hand trailing along the shelves until I found the staircase to the basement archive. The archive was run by Eleanor Pine, a woman who was as much a fixture of the town's history as the artifacts she curated. She was sharp, meticulous, and possessed a memory for local lore that was legendary. If anyone would notice the historical inconsistencies, it would be her. I found her sitting at her large oak desk, not working but staring at a framed photograph. The only light in the room came from a battery-powered lantern on her desk, casting long, dancing shadows. "Eleanor?" I said softly. She looked up, her eyes taking a moment to focus on me. There was a profound exhaustion in her face, a deep-seated weariness that went beyond lack of sleep. "Leo," she said, her voice flat. "Library's closed. I know, I'm sorry to intrude, but I need to ask you about something. It's important." I walked closer, my eyes falling on the photograph she was holding. It was a picture of her and a man with a kind smile and a thick mustache, standing in front of the library. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" I pressed. "You feel it too." She looked from the photograph to me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the sharp, intelligent woman I knew. "The town charter," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been reading it every day since I was 16. I know it by heart. This morning, the third paragraph was different. The part about the founding families, the name Holloway is gone. There's just a blank space where it used to be." Relief washed over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. I wasn't alone. "It's not just the charter," I said, my voice low and urgent. "It's people, places. Briar Lane is gone, Eleanor. David Gable never existed." She flinched at the names, a pained recognition in her eyes. "I remember a boy," she started, then trailed off, her brow furrowing. "A boy with blue eyes. Who was he?" The The memory was already dissolving, the gray seeping into the cracks in her mind. "We have to fight this," I said, placing my hands on her desk. "We have to document it. The physical records, the old maps, the photographs. They're the key. They hold the truth." She looked down at the photograph in her hands again. "My husband, Robert," she said, her voice barely audible. "He passed away 2 years ago. We were married for 47 years. This morning I woke up and for a full minute, I couldn't remember his face. I had to look at this picture to remember the man I shared my life with." Tears welled in her eyes. "How do you fight something that takes your own heart from you, Leo? How do you document a world that makes you forget you ever had something to mourn?" Before I could answer, a low hum started to emanate from the walls around us. It was a deep, resonant frequency that vibrated in my teeth. The lantern on the desk flickered violently. From the far corner of the archive, a section shrouded in deep shadow, the humming grew louder. A stillness pocket was forming. A big one. "We have to go," I said, grabbing her arm. "Now!" But Eleanor was paralyzed, her gaze fixed on the corner. "The silence," she whispered in horror. "It's so loud." The humming intensified, and the air grew thick, heavy, as if the pressure was dropping. The shadows in the corner seemed to deepen, to coalesce, pulling the faint light into them. I tugged harder at her arm, but she wouldn't move. She was transfixed. "It wants the old things," she murmured. "It's hungry." With a sudden, sickening lurch, the bookshelves in the corner of the room began to distort. The straight lines of the shelves warped and bowed inwards, pulled toward an invisible point. Ancient books tumbled from the shelves, not falling to the floor, but being drawn into the darkness, their pages fluttering silently before they vanished completely. The fabric of reality itself was being consumed right before our eyes. Panic, primal and absolute, finally broke through Eleanor's trance. We scrambled for the stairs, the sound of splintering wood and the terrifying, silent collapse of history at our backs. We burst out of the side door and into the gray, gasping for breath. We didn't stop running until we reached the town square. We stood there, under the dim, hazy glow of the streetlights, our breath pluming in the cold air. The library from the outside looked perfectly unharmed, but we both knew that a part of it, a part of the town's soul, had just been devoured. Eleanor was shaking uncontrollably. "It's over," she wept, her face buried in her hands. "We can't stop it." "No," I said, my own fear forging itself into a hard, cold resolve. "We can't stop it yet, but we can map it, we can define its edges. As long as we have a record, it's not a complete victory for the Gray." I looked at her, my mind racing. "There has to be a reason this is happening here. An origin point. An anchor." Eleanor looked up, wiping tears from her face. A spark of the archivist, the historian, returned to her eyes. "The town's founder," she said slowly. "Jeremiah Havenwood. He wasn't just a pioneer. He was a surveyor, like you. His original journals, his maps, they weren't in the section that disappeared. They're in the founder's vault, behind the main desk." My heart leaped. "Can we get to them?" "They're sealed in a fireproof iron safe. It might have protected them." Our shared purpose was a fragile shield against the encroaching dread. We had to go back. As we turned to look back toward the library, my blood ran cold. Standing across the square, half shrouded in the thick fog, was a figure. It was motionless, watching us. It looked like Sheriff Brody, but it was too still. Its posture was too perfect, and as it took a step forward, its movement was wrong. It was a smooth, gliding motion, unnaturally fluid, like a puppet being pulled on a string. It wasn't Brody. It was an imitation. A shell. The Gray was no longer just erasing. It was learning to fill the gaps. I grabbed Eleanor's hand. "Don't look at it. We need to get back to the library. Now, before it gets there first." We ran, our footsteps echoing in a town that was growing quieter by the second. We were no longer just fighting an invisible, conceptual horror. Now, the horror had a face, and it was wearing the face of a man we trusted. We were mapping the edges of a nightmare, and the nightmare was beginning to map us in return. We didn't dare look back. The image of the Brody thing, so placidly inhuman, was burned into my mind. To look back would be to give it a shape, to acknowledge its reality, and I felt on a primal level that this was what it wanted. Attention was a form of nourishment for it. The library's main doors were heavy oak, and for a terrifying moment, the key in Eleanor's trembling hand refused to turn. Behind us, I could hear the soft, rhythmic scuff of shoes on pavement. a sound that was far too slow for a pursuit, yet held 1,000 times more menace than running footsteps. It wasn't chasing us, it was hurting us. With a final, desperate twist, the lock clicked open. We tumbled inside, slamming the heavy doors shut and throwing the deadbolt, a gesture that felt laughably futile against a threat that could erase the very concept of a door. "The vault," Eleanor gasped, her voice ragged. "It's behind the main circulation desk." The interior of the library had changed. The oppressive gloom was the same, but the geometry of the room felt unstable. The long rows of bookshelves no longer seemed perfectly parallel. They canted at subtle, disorienting angles, as if the floor beneath them was uneven, though my feet told me it was perfectly flat. It was a space drawn by an artist with a faulty sense of perspective. A soft, wet dripping sound echoed from the high, vaulted ceiling. I looked up but could see nothing in the darkness. "This way," Eleanor whispered, pulling me toward the enormous curved circulation desk that dominated the center of the reading room. Her fear was palpable, but it was overridden by a lifetime of professional duty. This was her domain, and she would not let it be violated without a fight. Behind the desk was a small, unmarked door, flush with the wall. Eleanor produced another key, this one larger and more ornate, and unlocked it. The founder's vault was little more than a closet, the air inside dry and cool. Dominating the small space was an iron safe, black and imposing, a relic from the late 19th century. "Jeremiah Havenwood's folly," Eleanor said, running a hand over the cold metal. "The town council thought he was mad for insisting on it. Said it was a vanity. He said it was to protect the town's root charter from fire, flood, or a failure of memory. A failure of memory." The word sent a fresh chill down my spine. He knew. 150 years ago, the town's founder knew this could happen. The safe had a combination dial. Eleanor's fingers, surprisingly steady now, spun the dial with practiced confidence. Left, right, left. A series of satisfyingly solid clicks echoed in the small room. She pulled the heavy, groaning door open. Inside, protected from the ravages of time and unreality, lay a small collection of leather-bound volumes and rolled-up parchments. They smelled of old paper, leather, and something else, a faint, clean scent of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. I reached in and carefully lifted out the topmost journal. The leather was worn smooth, and the cover was embossed with a single stylized H. I opened it. The pages were filled with Jeremiah Havenwood's handwriting. A tight, precise script that spoke of a mind as meticulous as my own. But it wasn't just words. The pages were a tapestry of text, mathematical formulas and strange, esoteric symbols I didn't recognize, somewhere between astronomical charts and alchemical signs. "What does it say?" Eleanor breathed, peering over my shoulder. I scanned the first page, my eyes catching on a phrase that made my blood run cold. October 12th, 1874. "The gray stillness has returned to the valley. It is a subtle poison seeping first into the periphery of perception. The men complain of misplaced tools and forgotten conversations. They are treating it as common absent-mindedness. They do not understand. The stillness does not cause one to forget. It removes the thing to be remembered." He was describing the same phenomenon, the same insidious erasure. I flipped through the pages, a frantic montage of a century-old horror story flashing before my eyes. He documented missing livestock, a creek that changed its course overnight, a family of settlers on the valley's edge who vanished, leaving behind a cabin that neighbors swore had never been there. He was dismissed as a superstitious eccentric, a man driven to paranoia by the isolation of the frontier. "He tried to warn them," I murmured, "and they didn't listen." "Look at this," Eleanor said, carefully unrolling one of the parchments. It was a map of the valley, but unlike any I had ever seen. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess of survey lines and topographical sketches, overlaid with the same strange symbols from the journal. And in the center of the map, circled multiple times in dark red ink, was the area designated as the Blackwood Quarry. Scrawled next to it was a single, heavily underlined sentence: "The stillness hungers for shape. It is a void, and a void requires an anchor. Where reality is thinnest, it takes root. What is not mapped is not real." The anchor, the quarry, the place where the church bell's sound had originated. It all clicked into place. This wasn't a random event. The gray was a parasite, and it had attached itself to a weak point in the valley's reality. The quarry, a place that had been literally hollowed out, its very substance removed from the world. A thunderous crash from the main reading room made us both jump. It was the sound of the great oak doors splintering, followed by the slow, deliberate scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. It was inside. "We have to go," I whispered, my voice choked with adrenaline. "Take as much as you can carry." We stuffed the journals and rolled maps into my rucksack. Just as I was cinching it closed, my eyes fell on one last object in the safe, a brass and wood tool that I recognized instantly. It was a 19th century surveyor's compass, its needle still steady, its glass face gleaming. But etched around the compass rows were those same strange symbols from the journal. This was more than a directional tool. It was something else. I grabbed it and shoved it into my pocket. We cracked the vault door open and peered out. The library was darker now, and the dripping sound from the ceiling was louder, closer. The Brody thing was at the far end of the reading room, its back to us. It was methodically pulling books from the shelves, not reading them, but simply dropping them into a pile on the floor. With each book that fell, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, the strange, off-kilter angles of the shelves becoming more pronounced. "It's feeding," Eleanor breathed in horror. "It's erasing the stories." We had to get to the side door we'd used before. It meant crossing the open space behind the main desk, a 30-foot stretch of terrifyingly empty floor. Keeping low, we slipped out of the vault. Every creak of the floorboards under our feet sounded like a cannon shot. The Brody thing didn't turn. It continued its placid, systematic destruction. We were halfway across when Eleanor stumbled, her foot catching on a chair that hadn't been there a moment before. She let out a small, sharp cry of pain. The scraping of books stopped. An absolute, profound silence fell over the room. It was the silence of the gray, the utter void of sound, and it was radiating from the figure at the end of the aisle. Slowly, unnaturally, it turned. Its head rotated on its neck with a smooth, frictionless motion that no human spine would allow. Its face was calm, its expression one of mild curiosity, but its eyes were wrong. They were flat, depthless pools of black, reflecting the dim light without a hint of life. "Eleanor Pine," it said, its voice a perfect imitation of Sheriff Brody's warm baritone, yet utterly devoid of warmth. "Your property taxes are overdue." The mundane, nonsensical statement was more terrifying than any threat. It was a broken echo, a fragment of the real Brody's knowledge, twisted into a hollow mockery. It started towards us, its walk no longer the smooth gliding motion from outside, but a jerky, disjointed shamble, as if it was still learning the complex mechanics of a human body and getting it slightly wrong. Each step was accompanied by a faint, wet clicking sound. We scrambled for the side door. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers numb and useless. Behind us, the clicking grew louder. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw that the Brody thing's form was shimmering. Its edges were blurred, and the pattern on its flannel shirt seemed to crawl and shift like living insects. It was losing cohesion, the effort of maintaining a human form under stress proving too much. The lock finally gave way, and we burst out into the fog, but our escape route was cut off. Two more figures stood in the alleyway, blocking our path. One looked like Mrs. Gable. The other was a young man I didn't recognize, but his face was a mask of placid indifference. They were everywhere. The town was already lost. "The roof," Eleanor croaked, pointing to a rusty fire escape ladder on the side of the building. It was our only option. I went first, the heavy rucksack throwing me off balance. The cold, wet metal of the ladder was slick beneath my hands. Eleanor followed, her movements surprisingly agile for a woman her age. Below us, the three figures gathered at the base of the ladder, not attempting to follow, but simply watching, their heads tilted in unison. Their silence was more unnerving than any scream. The roof of the library was a flat expanse of tar and gravel, an alien landscape shrouded in the thick, swirling gray. The fog was denser up here, visibility reduced to less than 10 feet. It felt like we were standing on an island in a featureless ocean. "What now?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with panic. "We have to get off the street level," I said, my mind racing. "The quarry. The journal said it was the anchor. If we can get there." A sound cut me off, the sound of a door opening. It came from a small structure in the center of the roof, the access hatch for the rooftop maintenance. As we watched, the hatch lifted and a fourth figure emerged. This one was different. It was smaller, slighter. It looked like a child, a young girl with blonde pigtails wearing a bright yellow raincoat. Her face was a blank, expressionless oval, and her eyes were the same dead, black pits as the Brody thing. It took a step towards us, and from its unmoving lips came a sound that was not a child's voice. It was a chorus of whispers, a blend of all the voices of the people who had been erased, a soft, sibilant wave of sound that spoke a single word. Found. The child thing raised a hand, and the fog around us began to move. It was no longer a passive mist, but an active, hungry entity, swirling and coalescing, its tendrils reaching for us like ghostly fingers. The very air was turning against us. We were trapped on a rooftop in a dying world, hunted by the ghosts of the forgotten, and the fog itself was closing in for the kill. The word found hung in the air, a death knell delivered by a chorus of ghosts. The fog, once a passive shroud, was now a predator. It coiled and writhed, its tendrils solidifying into grasping, semi-translucent limbs that clawed at the gravel on the roof, dragging the main body of the mist closer. There was nowhere to run. To our left was a 50-foot drop to the street. To our right, the fire escape was guarded by the silent, watching mimics. Behind us, the child thing was a nexus of the swirling horror, its small form the only still point in a vortex of unreality. "The next building!" Eleanor shouted, her voice sharp with desperation. She pointed toward the adjoining structure, the old Havenwood Town Hall. Its roof was a few feet lower than the library's, separated by a 10-foot alleyway. It was a leap of faith, a jump into a swirling gray abyss, but it was the only path that wasn't certain death. "We'll never make it!" I yelled back, the wind whipped up by the unnatural fog tearing at my clothes. "We have to." The child thing took another placid step, and the whispers intensified, worming their way into my mind. I heard Mrs. Gable's voice, David's voice, the voices of the council members from the charter, all of them begging me to be still, to accept the quiet, to join them in the gray. The rucksack, filled with the heavy journals, felt like an anchor dragging me down. But it was also our only hope. The knowledge within it was the only weapon we had. I backed away toward the edge of the roof, my heels scraping against the low parapet. "On 3, I screamed to Eleanor. 1, 2. A thick, ropey tendril of fog shot out from the vortex, wrapping around my ankle with surprising strength. It was shockingly cold, a deep, bone-aching cold that felt like it was leaching the heat and life from my body. I kicked at it, but my foot passed through it as if it were smoke, yet the grip remained. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She lunged forward and swung her own heavy bag, a satchel filled with historical pamphlets and research notes, at the tendril. The bag connected with a dull, wet slap, and the tendril dissolved with a faint hiss, like water on a hot skillet. The analog world, the world of paper and ink and leather, had a power against this ethereal enemy. "Now!" she screamed. I didn't wait for 3. I took a running start, pushed off from the ledge, and leaped into the void. For a heart-stopping second, I was suspended in the swirling gray, the lights of the town a distant, blurry memory below. I landed hard on the tarred roof of the town hall, my knees and hands screaming in protest as they absorbed the impact. I scrambled to my feet, turning just in time to see Eleanor make the jump behind me. She was lighter and landed more gracefully, her face a grim mask of determination. We didn't pause to celebrate. We scrambled away from the edge, putting as much distance as possible between us and the library. From across the alley, the child thing watched us, its head tilted. It made no move to follow. It didn't have to. It raised its small hand again, and the fog that blanketed the town hall roof began to thicken and stir, answering its silent command. "There has to be a roof access door," I gasped, scanning the unfamiliar rooftop. We found it near a cluster of old ventilation units, a heavy metal hatch secured by a rusty padlock. Hope withered in my chest. We were still trapped. But Eleanor Pine, the town archivist, was a woman of hidden resources. From a chain around her neck, tucked beneath her collar, she produced a small, antique key. "The mayor gave this to my grandfather in 1952, she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It opens every municipal door in Havenwood Creek. He said it was in case of a Soviet invasion." The key slid into the rusty lock. For a moment, it refused to turn. I put my hand over hers and we pushed together. With a tortured groan of metal, the lock sprang open. We pulled the heavy hatch, revealing a dark, square hole that smelled of dust and forgotten time. We descended the iron rungs of the ladder, leaving the grasping fog and the silent, watching things behind, plunging into the relative safety of the building's interior. We found ourselves in a dusty, cavernous attic space, the town hall's forgotten upper floor. Moonlight, filtered through the thick gray, shone through a large, grime-covered Palladian window, illuminating a graveyard of discarded furniture, stacked boxes of records, and dressmakers' dummies that looked like a silent, headless congregation in the gloom. It was creepy, but it was safe. For now. We collapsed onto a dust-sheeted divan, our bodies aching, our minds reeling. The silence in the attic was a welcome relief, a natural quiet, not the hungry, pressing void of the stillness. We need to see what Havenwood knew, I said after a few minutes, my breathing finally returning to normal. I slid the rucksack from my shoulders and carefully laid the journals and maps on the floor. Eleanor lit the battery-powered lantern from her bag, its warm, steady glow pushing back the shadows. In its light, we pored over the Founder's legacy. For the next hour, we were no longer Leo and Eleanor, but students of a forgotten science, deciphering the frantic notes of a man who had faced this same enemy a century and a half ago. Havenwood's writings grew more desperate and arcane as he documented the progression of the stillness. He called the mimics hollows or echoes. They are not copies, he wrote. They are the void's attempt to comprehend what it has consumed. It wears the shapes of the erased like a child trying on its father's coat. It has the form, but no understanding of the man within. It recites fragments of memory, a name, a civic duty, a favorite song, but the context is gone. They are shells, animated by a hunger they do not comprehend. That explained the Brody Thing's bizarre statement about property taxes. It was a distorted fragment, a piece of the real sheriff's mind, regurgitated without meaning. We found his detailed theory on the anchor at the quarry. He described it as a perceptual vacuum, a place where the barrier between our world and the formless void from which the stillness emanated was naturally thin. His illustrations showed our dimension as a taut sheet of fabric and the anchor as a pinprick hole in its surface, through which the gray was leaking. Then we found the plan. His last desperate gambit. To mend the hole, he wrote, one cannot simply patch it. One must convince the hole that it is, in fact, solid ground. The anchor must be defined. It must be given properties, boundaries, a name, a history. It must be mapped, not just in 3 dimensions, but in 4. It must be locked into a specific time and place. This is a ritual of definition, a surveyor's exorcism. I will take my instruments to the quarry at dawn. I will use the compass, calibrated not just to magnetic north, but to the conceptual constants of our reality, to perform the great survey. I will impose our world's logic upon the illogical. May God grant me the strength of will to succeed. The next entry was a single, shaky sentence, the ink blotted as if his hand was trembling uncontrollably. It is too strong, it sees into my mind. It is showing me a world where I was never born. I cannot hold the lines. The journal ended there. He had failed. He was trying to fight a metaphysical cancer with a ruler and a compass, Eleanor whispered in awe. It's the only way, I said, my gaze falling on the strange compass I'd taken from the safe. As I pulled it from my pocket, its needle, which should have been pointing north, began to spin wildly. The strange symbols etched around its face began to emit a faint, silvery light. His tools weren't just for measuring distance. They were calibrated to measure reality itself. I looked at Eleanor, the terrifying weight of our situation settling upon me. He failed. He was a pioneer, a brilliant surveyor. What chance do I have? You have his notes, she said, her voice firm, pulling me back from the edge of despair. You have his compass, and you have me. He was alone, Leo. We are not. Her strength was a lifeline. She was right. We had to try. We had to get to the quarry. We spent another hour planning, enough memorizing Havenwood's map of the quarry and his notes on the ritual. Then we began the journey. We couldn't risk the streets, so we opted for a more perilous route, the rooftops. We moved from the town hall to the adjoining solicitor's office, then to the old mercantile building. It was a slow, nerve-wracking trek across a city of sleeping giants, the gray mist swirling around our feet. From our vantage point, we could see the state of the town. It was unraveling. The neat grid of Havenwood Creek streets was beginning to fray. An intersection down the block simply ended in a smooth, featureless, gray wall of fog. A house I'd known my whole life was flickering, fading in and out of existence like a bad projection. The hollows were everywhere, but their behavior was bizarre. We saw a mimic of our mailman, Tom, meticulously placing blank sheets of paper into mailboxes. We saw the baker, his hands moving in a practiced rhythm, kneading nothing on a countertop that wasn't there. They were trapped in the loops of the lives they had replaced, their purpose forgotten, their actions hollowed of all meaning. They were the truest ghosts I had ever seen. Getting down from the rooftops was the most dangerous part. We found a rickety fire escape at the back of the mercantile that led down into a dark, narrow alley. We descended into the gloom, our feet touching the ground for the first time in hours. The air at street level was thick, heavy, and a low, almost subsonic hum vibrated through the soles of my shoes. We were making our way toward the edge of town, staying in the shadows, when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic squeaking. It was coming from the playground in the center of the town park. Peering through the wrought iron fence, we saw a single swing moving back and forth in the thick fog. Sitting on the swing was the child thing in the yellow raincoat. It wasn't looking at us, it was just swinging, its head tilted up toward the featureless gray sky, a picture of childhood innocence that was so profoundly wrong it made my stomach clench. We had to pass the park to get to the quarry road. There was no other way. "Stay low, stay quiet," I whispered to Eleanor, my hand gripping the heavy brass compass in my pocket. Its faint light seemed to pulse in time with my terrified heartbeat. We crept along the fence line, using a row of overgrown hedges as cover. The only sound was the steady, hypnotic squeak, squeak, squeak of the swing. We were almost past the playground when the squeaking stopped. I froze, not daring to breathe. Eleanor squeezed my arm, her knuckles white. A new sound began. The soft, crunching sound of small feet walking on gravel. It was moving away from the swings toward the center of the park. Then the whispers started again, faint at first, then growing in volume like a chorus of forgotten voices carried on the dead air. They weren't speaking words this time, they were humming, a simple, familiar tune, a child's nursery rhyme. We didn't wait to hear the end of it. We ran. We burst from the cover of the hedges and sprinted down the street, our footsteps loud and panicked in the silent town. We reached the edge of town a few minutes later, collapsing behind the crumbling stone wall that marked the start of the quarry road. My lungs burned, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. The humming had faded behind us. We were out of the main town, but we were heading into something far worse. Before us, the road disappeared into a solid, churning wall of the gray. It was darker here, a roiling mass of black and charcoal shot through with veins of a sickly purple light. This wasn't the passive mist that had blanketed the town. This was the nexus. This was the wound. The humming we felt through the ground was emanating from within that vortex of fog. I pulled out Havenwood's compass. The needle was no longer spinning. It was pointing directly into the heart of the swirling darkness, its silvery light a steady, defiant pinprick against the oppressive gloom. "This is it," I said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "The anchor is in there." Eleanor looked from the compass to the churning wall of nothingness. "Jeremiah Havenwood went in there and never came out." "This time is different," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of ozone and cold stone. We had the knowledge, we had the tools. We were standing at the edge of the abyss, and the only way forward was to step inside. The air at the mouth of the quarry road was a physical barrier. Stepping into it was like plunging into ice water. The immediate shock was a sensory overload. The humming intensified to a deafening drone that vibrated deep in my bones. The smell of ozone was thick and metallic, and the world dissolved into a maelstrom of churning, purple-black fog. "Stay close," I yelled to Eleanor, my voice sounding thin and distant, as if snatched away by the wind. "Hold on to the rucksack." She gripped the canvas strap on my shoulder, her knuckles a pale set of bumps in the gloom. We were each other's only anchor now. I held Havenwood's compass aloft. Its steady, silvery light was the only thing that seemed to obey the laws of physics in this place, a single point of order in a universe of chaos. It cast a small 3-foot pool of coherent reality around us. Outside its glow, the world warped and buckled. The road beneath our feet felt both solid and liquid, and the short path to the quarry floor became an impossible journey. With every step, the entity probed our minds, sifting through our memories, searching for the cracks in our resolve. It came for Eleanor first. I felt her stumble, her grip tightening on my pack. "Robert?" she whispered, her voice filled with a heartbreaking mixture of hope and confusion. She was staring into the fog ahead, but her eyes were seeing something else. "Robert, is that you?" "Eleanor, no!" I shouted, pulling her back. "It's not real! It's a trick!" "But I can see him," she sobbed, tears freezing on her cheeks. "He's standing by the old gazebo in the park. He's asking why I forgot our anniversary." The stillness was a cruel artist. It wasn't just showing her a ghost, it was weaponizing her deepest fear, the fear of her memory failing, of losing the most precious parts of her past. "Eleanor, listen to me," I said, turning to face her, forcing her to look at me instead of the phantom vision. "What was the name of the book you were reading the day he proposed? The one with the broken spine." Her eyes, clouded with grief and confusion, struggled to focus. "I don't think," I urged, my voice raw. "You told me the story. He interrupted you. You were annoyed at first. What was the book?" A flicker of light of memory sparked in her gaze. "It was The Count of Monte Cristo," she said, the words pulling her back from the brink. "He said I had waited long enough for my treasure." "Yes," I said, squeezing her shoulder. "Hold on to that. That's real. The rest is just ink, phantoms on a page it can't read." The vision of her husband dissolved, and she let out a ragged cry, a mixture of pain and relief. The entity, its first attack thwarted, turned its attention to me. The world dropped away. I was no longer in the quarry. I was back in the city, surrounded by towering, featureless skyscrapers that blocked out the sky. The power was out. Sirens wailed in the distance. I was a child again, separated from my parents, lost in an endless grid of identical streets. The feeling of absolute, directionless terror, the feeling I had dedicated my life to never experiencing again, washed over me. The whispers came, not from the fog, but from inside my own head, a soothing, seductive murmur. "You see," the voice whispered, "there are no maps here. No north, no south, just the endless maze. But you don't have to be lost, Leo. You can let go, you can dissolve, become part of something larger. No direction needed. No choices to make. Just peace. Just stillness." My legs felt heavy, my will to move draining away. The idea was so tempting. To just stop, to let the gray take me, to erase the fear, to erase the responsibility. "Leo." Eleanor's voice cut through the illusion, sharp and clear. "The compass! Look at the compass." I forced my eyes open. I was on my knees on the quarry floor, the brass compass on the ground in front of me. Its light was flickering, dimming. The entity was attacking our only true guide. I thought of Havenwood's last desperate journal entry. "I cannot hold the lines. He'd face this alone. I was not alone." "It feeds on confusion," I gasped, climbing back to my feet, Eleanor helping me up. "It uses our own minds against us. We have to give it something else to look at." We stumbled forward, no longer just observers, but combatants. We spoke to each other constantly, a litany of facts to anchor us in the real. "My name is Leo Vance. I am a cartographer," I said, my voice shaking. "The Earth is 93 million miles from the sun." "My name is Eleanor Pine. I'm an archivist," she responded, her voice gaining strength. "Havenwood Creek was founded in 1872. A perfect circle is 360 degrees. The Dewey Decimal System was invented by Melville Dewey. We were two lonely scholars, shouting the rules of our reality into the face of a formless god of chaos. And with every declaration, the compass's light grew stronger, steadier. The phantoms receded. The path forward, while still warped and treacherous, became navigable. Finally, we reached the bottom of the quarry. The humming was so intense here, it was a physical pressure against my skin. In the center of the vast, hollowed-out space was the anchor. It was not a monster. It was an absence. A perfect sphere of absolute blackness, roughly the size of a small car, hovering a few feet above the ground. It did not reflect the compass's light. It drank it. The air and rock around it were bent and distorted, pulled inward like water circling a drain. Standing near it felt like my very atoms were being tugged apart. Drifting slowly around the sphere were the primal hollows, not the mimics from the town, but shifting, semi-solid shapes of pure shadow, their forms vaguely humanoid one moment, terrifyingly geometric the next. They paid us no mind, their entire existence focused on the void they served. This is it, I breathed. The hole in the world. There was no more time for fear. We had a purpose. I pulled the tools from my rucksack, my grandfather's transit, the ranging rods, the ball of twine. My hands, miraculously, were steady. This was my element. The world might be ending, but there was a job to be done. I set up the transit. Its brass and steel form a defiant piece of logic in this impossible place. I drove the ranging rods into the ground, creating the baseline for my survey. Eleanor stood ready with Havenwood's journal and a pencil, her face illuminated by the lantern at her feet. Ready? I called to her, my voice sounding impossibly small. She nodded, her expression grim but resolute. Ready. I sighted the edge of the black sphere through the transit's eyepiece. First angle, 47 degrees, 16 minutes. 47 degrees, 16 minutes, she shouted back, her voice echoing unnaturally. She scribbled it into the journal. The moment the words were spoken, the sphere seemed to pulse. A wave of psychic pressure washed over us. The hollows turned their featureless faces toward us. Keep going, Eleanor yelled. Don't let it think. I moved to my next point, my mind a fortress of numbers and angles. Baseline distance, 94 feet, 3 inches. 94 feet, 3 inches, she cried, her voice ringing with defiance. She wasn't just recording, she was declaring. Named for the year 1894, when the first steam shovel arrived in this quarry. She was adding history, context. She was fighting with her own weapons. The sphere pulsed again, more violently this time. A vision flooded my mind. My office, my maps, all of them burning, the ink turning to ash, my life's work undone. I gritted my teeth, forcing it away. Second angle, 112 degrees, 5 minutes. 112 degrees, Eleanor shouted. The number of steps to the top of the St. Giles bell tower, built by the Halloway family, who are not forgotten. With every measurement we declared, the anchor fought back. It showed me my parents' faces, blank and unknowing, asking who I was. It showed Eleanor the library, its shelves empty, its purpose erased. But we held the line. We were a two-person bulwark of reality, using the simple, powerful magic of numbers, words, and memory. The hollows began to drift closer, their shadowy forms elongating, reaching for us. It wasn't enough. We were just defining its edges, and it was still too strong. I remembered Havenwood's failure. He had only measured. I had to do more. It needs a name, I screamed over the drone. It needs a definition. I abandoned the transit and walked as close to the sphere as I dared, the cold it radiated biting at my skin. I held Havenwood's compass before me like a shield. I am Leo Vance, cartographer of Havenwood Creek, I roared into the void. And this is my survey. I name you the anchor of stillness. The sphere shuddered, and a low, mournful moan emanated from its core. You have a boundary, I shouted, pacing the perimeter I had mapped. Its circumference is 52 feet. Your composition is absolute negation. Your temperature is the absence of heat. Your history begins now, Eleanor joined in, her voice soaring. On this day, in this quarry, you were measured and you were named. You are no longer a nameless void. You exist here, I bellowed, planting my final ranging rod into the ground like a spear. And only here. You are contained. You are mapped. As I spoke the final word, the compass in my hand flared with a blinding silver light. The light shot out, striking the black sphere. For a moment, the sphere resisted, its darkness absolute. Then, cracks of silver light spiderwebbed across its surface. With a sound that was both a deafening shatter and an absolute silence, the sphere collapsed in on itself. The crushing drone ceased. The psychic pressure vanished. The swirling vortex of fog throughout the quarry was sucked violently toward the center, drawn into the point where the sphere had been. In its place, a new form rose from the ground, a sleek, sharp obelisk of perfect, non-reflective black stone about 10 feet tall. It was solid. It was real. It hummed with a dormant, contained power, but it was no longer a wound. It was a scar. The gray was gone. Above us, through the newly cleared air, the first stars of the evening were beginning to appear in a bruised purple sky. We had won. 2 weeks later, the sun shines on Havenwood Creek, but it is a smaller, quieter town than it was before. The houses at the end of Elm Street are still gone, the lots they stood on now covered in wildflowers. Briar Lane is just a memory shared between two people. The survivors feel a collective melancholy, a grief for people and places they cannot name. Eleanor and I are the town's secret historians, the keepers of the complete map. The military came and went. They found no radiation, no contaminants, just a town with gaps in its census and a strange, new geological formation in the old quarry. They asked questions we couldn't answer and eventually left, classifying Havenwood Creek as an anomaly to be monitored from a distance. I am in my office. The room is the same, but I am not. My obsession with control, with knowing exactly where I am, is gone. In its place is a new, heavier purpose. On my main drafting table is my masterwork. It is a new map of the valley. It is meticulously detailed, recording not just what currently exists, but what was lost. The vanished streets are drawn in faint, ghosted lines. The names of the erased are listed in the margins. It is a map of memory. And in the center, at the site of the Blackwood Quarry, is a detailed rendering of a black obelisk surrounded by warnings and the strange arcane symbols from Jeremiah Havenwood's compass. I am no longer just a cartographer of what is. I am a warden of what was and a guardian against the emptiness that waits just beyond the charted world. I faced the ultimate void, the terror of being lost and unwritten, and I found my true direction. I held the line, I drew the map, and for now, the stillness is contained. For now, the world is real.